The road back home. The rhythmic hum of the plane's engines filled the air, but Captain James Carter barely noticed. His hands were clasped tightly together, fingers pressing into his palms as he stared at the empty seat in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the rush of combat or the weight of a rifle, but from the anxiety clawing at his insides. He was finally going home. After 3 deployments, countless battles, and losing more comrades than he cared to count, James had received his final orders: discharge. His time in the military had come to an end, and now he was returning to a world that felt more foreign than the war zones he had lived in for years. His fingers brushed against the worn envelope in his pocket, the last letter from Lily, his wife. She had written to him about the baby. Our baby, he reminded himself. He should have been thrilled, overjoyed even, but instead, a deep unease settled over him. Could he be the father this child deserved? Could he be the husband Lily needed? "Sir," a flight attendant's voice pulled him from his thoughts. James blinked, looking up at the woman standing beside him. "We're about to land. Do you need anything?" she asked with a polite but tired smile. He forced a nod. "No, I'm good. Thank you." As she walked away, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. The plane jolted slightly as it began its descent, the city lights below glowing like a constellation spread across the earth. Home. It felt like a lifetime since he had last been here. A family reunited. The airport was packed. People hugged their returning loved ones, children ran to their parents, and tears flowed freely. James watched as a soldier beside him was nearly tackled by his wife and kids, their laughter echoing through the terminal. Would Lily react the same way? Would she run into his arms, overjoyed at his return? Or had the months apart, the years of deployment, built an invisible wall between them? Then he saw her. Lily stood near the exit, her coat wrapped tightly around her small frame, golden brown hair cascading over her shoulders. But it wasn't just her that caught his attention. It was the small bundle in her arms. Their baby. James' breath hitched in his throat. Lily's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, she started walking toward him. He wanted to run to her, to wrap her in his arms, to assure himself that this wasn't just another dream born out of loneliness and longing, but his feet felt like they were made of lead. When she reached him, she hesitated for just a second before offering him a nervous smile. "Welcome home, James," she whispered. He swallowed the lump in his throat. I missed you." She exhaled shakily, nodding as her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then, carefully, she adjusted the blanket in her arms. "James, meet your son." His heart nearly stopped. Lily shifted, revealing the small face beneath the blanket. A tiny, peaceful face, lips slightly parted in sleep, tiny fingers curled into fists. James felt like the world had tilted beneath his feet. The weight of war, the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, everything faded into nothing as he looked at his son. He reached out, hesitating, as if afraid he might shatter this fragile moment. Lily gently placed the baby in his arms. The warmth, the scent of new life, overwhelmed him. James had held rifles, carried wounded soldiers, and lifted the weight of fallen friends. But this tiny, perfect child, felt heavier than anything he had ever held. He swallowed hard. He's so small. Lily laughed softly. They all start that way. James couldn't tear his gaze away from his son. He was perfect. But then, a flicker of something passed through his mind. An odd feeling, a sense of something not quite right. The baby's skin tone was darker than he expected. His features, they didn't quite match either of theirs. The unease returned, creeping in like a slow-moving shadow. James pushed it away. "Not now. Don't ruin this moment." He looked at Lily, forcing a smile. "He's beautiful." She let out a breath, relief washing over her face. "He missed you." James kissed the top of his son's tiny head, inhaling deeply. "I'm here now," he murmured, "and I'm not going anywhere." Shadows of doubt. That night, as James sat in their bedroom, the baby asleep in the bassinet beside their bed, he found himself staring. Lily had fallen asleep almost instantly, exhaustion evident in the way her body curled into itself. But James couldn't sleep. His son's peaceful breathing filled the quiet room, but that lingering doubt gnawed at him. He ran a hand over his face. "Stop it. You've been gone for months. Maybe you're just imagining things." But the seed had already been planted, and as much as James wanted to ignore it, he knew that some questions could never be left unanswered. Not when they could change everything. A cracked reflection. The night air was cool against James Carter's skin, but he barely noticed. He stood on the back porch of his home, a place that should have felt comforting. But tonight, it felt unfamiliar. The gentle sound of crickets mixed with the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees, yet none of it could drown out the thoughts racing in his head. Inside, Lily was asleep, their newborn son nestled safely beside her in the bassinet. James had watched them for hours before stepping outside, unable to quiet the voice whispering in his mind. Why does he look so different? The question made his stomach churn. He hated himself for even thinking it, but there was no denying it. His son didn't share his features, nor Lily's. James had spent years studying faces, identifying targets, distinguishing friend from foe in the chaos of battle. His instincts had been honed through war, and now those same instincts were gnawing at him like a slow, insidious poison. He rubbed his hands together, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of his palms. Am I being paranoid? He wanted to believe that. He needed to, but something deep inside him refused to let it go. Suddenly, the back door creaked open. "James." Lily's voice was soft, laced with exhaustion. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders as she stepped onto the porch, her bare feet brushing against the wooden planks. "You okay?" she asked, her gaze searching his face. James forced a smile, one he knew she saw through immediately. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." Lily stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "It's been a big day. You're home. You're a father. It's a lot to process." He nodded, squeezing her hand gently. But the doubt still sat there, heavy in his chest. Lily rested her head against his arm. "I missed you so much, James," she murmured. "And I know this is an adjustment. If you need time." "I don't need time," he interrupted, though his voice came out softer than he intended. I need to get used to all of this." She smiled, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "You will. I know you will." James hoped she was right. But deep down, he feared the battle within him had only just begun. Unease in the morning light. The next morning, James woke early, his body still operating on military time. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his sleeping wife, and the small bundle beside her. He's mine. He has to be mine. Slowly, he reached over and gently picked up his son. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. James studied his face. The smooth skin, the tiny nose, the dark lashes resting against plump cheeks. He traced the curve of his son's chin, his small hands, his soft curls. And yet, something still felt off. James had seen men die with more certainty than he felt now. The door to the nursery was slightly open, and he carried the baby inside, rocking him gently as he sat in the rocking chair. "You're my son," he whispered, but the words felt hollow. His chest tightened. He wanted to let it go, to trust Lily, to trust the love they had built over the years. But war had taught him one thing above all else. Doubt is what keeps you alive. James let out a slow breath. There was only one way to silence the voice in his head. He needed answers. The whispered doubts. At breakfast, James kept quiet, listening to Lily talk about small things, how the neighbors had helped while he was gone, how she had been nervous about the birth, how their son had been colicky the first few nights. He nodded, responding when necessary, but his mind was elsewhere. Finally, when Lily turned away to pour herself another cup of coffee, he asked, "Lily, does anyone in your family have darker skin?" She froze for half a second before turning back around. "What?" James tried to keep his tone casual. "I was just wondering. Your side, my side. Do we have any mixed ancestry?" Lily frowned slightly. "I don't know. I never really thought about it." "Why?" He hesitated. "Just curious." Her eyes studied him. "James, what are you really asking?" He knew that if he said it outright, it would break something between them. So he shook his head and forced a smile. "Nothing. Just a thought that crossed my mind." Lily's expression softened, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You're overthinking things," she said gently. "He's your son, James. He's ours." James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, you're right." But the doubt was still there, and it was only getting stronger. Seeking the truth. Later that day, while Lily was taking a nap, James made a decision. He left the house, walking down the street toward the nearest pharmacy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he scanned the shelves, his hands tightening into fists as he finally found what he was looking for. A paternity test. His fingers hovered over the box. "Do it," his instincts whispered. His training told him to always seek confirmation, to verify the truth before making a move. And yet, standing in this aisle, staring at the tiny, inoffensive-looking package, he felt sick. Would he really betray Lily's trust like this? Would he risk everything? James clenched his jaw. He didn't have a choice. The test that could break a family. That night, James waited until Lily was fast asleep. With careful, practiced precision, he swabbed the inside of his son's mouth, sealing the sample and preparing his own. His hands trembled slightly as he double-checked the instructions. This was it, the answer to the question that had been poisoning his mind since the moment he had held his child. As he sealed the envelope and prepared to send it off, his stomach churned. There was no turning back now. If he was right, it would change everything. If he was wrong, he might never forgive himself. Either way, the truth was coming. And James wasn't sure if he was ready for it. A homecoming that changed everything. Part 3. The Truth That Shatters. A Silent War. James Carter had faced firefights that lasted hours, ambushes that came without warning, and the suffocating pressure of command in the heat of battle. But nothing felt as agonizing as waiting for the results of the paternity test. The days dragged on like a slow march through enemy territory. Every minute felt like a year. He kept the secret buried deep, hiding the truth behind practiced smiles and hollow reassurances. But Lily wasn't a fool. "You've been acting strange," she murmured one night as she rested her head on his chest. The baby was asleep in the bassinet beside them, the soft rise and fall of his tiny body the only movement in the room. James swallowed hard. "I just had a lot on my mind." She traced small circles on his arm. "You're not used to being home yet, are you?" James exhaled. "No, it feels different." Lily tilted her head to look at him. "Do you regret coming back?" His heart ached at the sadness in her voice. "Of course not." She nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt. James forced himself to breathe. He had no right to feel guilty. "I just need to know the truth." The test results would be here soon. And then the war in his head would finally end. One way or another. The letter that changed everything. It arrived on a crisp morning. James was taking out the trash when he saw the envelope sitting inside the mailbox. The moment he saw the sender's name, his breath caught in his throat. "It's here." His hands trembled as he pulled it out. The world around him blurred. The sound of passing cars, the distant laughter of children playing down the street, the soft rustling of leaves. None of it existed. Only the envelope. He should wait. He should go inside, sit down, and read it with a clear head. But his body moved on its own. James tore the envelope open right there in the driveway, his fingers shaking as he unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the document, jumping past the formalities, the technical jargon, until he found it. Paternity probability. 99.99%. James' knees nearly buckled. He read it again. And again. He's mine. A wave of emotion slammed into him like a tidal wave. Relief, guilt, confusion. For weeks, he had let doubt consume him. He had questioned his wife. He had questioned his son. And now, the truth was staring him in the face. He had been wrong. James closed his eyes, his throat tightening. He had betrayed Lily's trust. He had doubted her faithfulness. What have I done? A deep, crushing shame settled in his chest. Then a voice shattered his thoughts. James. His head snapped up. Lily stood on the porch, their baby in her arms. Her expression was soft, but her eyes sought everything. James tried to shove the paper into his pocket, but it was too late. "What's that?" she asked. His mouth went dry. "Nothing," he said quickly. Too quickly. Lily frowned. "James." Her voice was different this time. Not gentle. Not trusting. James knew there was no escape. Slowly, hesitantly, he held out the paper. Lily shifted the baby to one arm and took the document with the other. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. And then her face changed. James had seen grief before. He had seen men lose friends, brothers in arms. He had seen parents cry over caskets draped in flags. But this was the kind of heartbreak that couldn't be healed. Lily looked up at him, her hands trembling. You took a paternity test." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. Her face twisted in pain. "You doubted me." James took a step forward. "Lily, I." She recoiled. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but James felt it like a bullet to the chest. "I don't believe this," she whispered, her voice breaking. James reached for her. "Lily, please." She took another step back. "You thought I cheated on you. His voice cracked. "I couldn't stop thinking about it. I let it get in my head." Lily let out a shaky laugh, not a happy one. "You mean you let war get in your head?" she said, her eyes glistening. "You let whatever happened to you out there ruin the trust we built." James clenched his fists. "It wasn't about not trusting you. It was about needing proof." Lily shook her head. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to pretend that this is okay. You should have talked to me." James swallowed, his throat raw. "I was scared." "Of what?" she demanded. James hesitated. "Of losing everything." Lily exhaled sharply. "Well, congratulations, James, because that's exactly what you just did." Broken foundations. The house felt colder than ever that night. Lily barely spoke. She moved around the house like a ghost, her presence there but distant. James watched from the doorway as she rocked the baby to sleep, her fingers running through his tiny curls. She didn't look up. She didn't say goodnight. James sat alone in the dark, his hands clasped together. For the first time since coming home, he felt like he was truly losing her. He had spent years fighting wars. Now he didn't know if he could survive the one happening in his own home. And this time, he had no one to blame but himself. A home in ruins, cold silence. James Carter had faced battlefields that roared with chaos, but nothing compared to the silence inside his home. The house, once warm and filled with laughter, was now suffocating. Every sound felt out of place, like a stranger intruding on something sacred. The air between him and Lily was thick with unspoken words, words too painful to say aloud. 3 days had passed since she found the paternity test. 3 days of barely a glance, barely a word. She did everything on autopilot, feeding the baby, cooking, cleaning, without once looking at him. James sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He watched Lily move around, every movement careful and controlled, as if she might shatter if she wasn't careful. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "Lily." She didn't respond. "Lily," he said again, his voice rough. She slowly turned to face him, arms crossed over her chest. Her face was unreadable. "Talk to me," James pleaded. "Please." Lily exhaled through her nose. "I don't know what you want me to say, James. I want you to tell me how we fix this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? You really think a conversation is going to fix this?" James' grip tightened around his cup. "I made a mistake." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "A mistake? Is that what you call it?" She let out a sharp breath. "James, you didn't just make a mistake. You doubted me, our marriage, our son. Do you even understand what that means?" "I do." His voice was tight with regret. "And I hate myself for it." Lily shook her head. "No, you don't get to hate yourself. You don't get to play the broken soldier who messed up and feels bad about it. You weren't on the battlefield when you did this, James. You were home. And you still acted like I was the enemy." James felt like she had physically struck him. "I was scared," he admitted. "I let doubt get in my head. I know that's not an excuse, but you still let it control you," she finished, her voice flat. James looked down, shame burning through his chest. Lily sighed, shaking her head as she rubbed her temple. "The worst part, I understand why you did it." His eyes snapped up to hers, confusion flickering in his expression. She let out a broken laugh. "You've been trained to doubt everything. War taught you that trust gets people killed, that hesitation costs lives. You don't believe anything unless you can prove it. That's what they turned you into." James swallowed hard. "But James, I'm not your enemy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And neither is our son." James stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with force. His hands went into his hair as he exhaled sharply, pacing. "I know that," he muttered. "I know. But it doesn't change the fact that I spent years looking over my shoulder, questioning every move, expecting betrayal." Lily's expression softened for a brief moment before it hardened again. "But you're not at war anymore." James stopped pacing, looking at her with tired eyes. "Aren't I?" he asked. She stilled. "You don't get it, Lily. War doesn't just end because I stepped off a plane. It follows me everywhere. I wake up expecting to hear gunfire. I sit with my back to the wall in every room. I flinch at loud noises. I see my dead friends when I close my eyes." His voice cracked, but he pushed through it. "And now I've gone and hurt the only people that matter to me. The one person who kept me sane when I was out there. The one person who wrote me letters and reminded me why I was even fighting in the first place." Lily's lips trembled, and for a moment, James thought she might reach for him. But then, her walls went back up. She took a deep breath, looking down at the floor before meeting his gaze again. "James," she said softly, "I love you. But I don't know if I can forgive you for this." The words shattered something inside him. James felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He had fought wars. He had survived near-death experiences. He had buried brothers in arms and carried the weight of their ghosts. But this was a different kind of pain. A pain he didn't know how to fight. "Lily," he choked out. "Please." She looked away. "I need time." James felt his heart sink. "How much time?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She shook her head. "I don't know." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the kitchen, drowning in guilt. That night, James sat in the nursery, watching his son sleep. The tiny rise and fall of his chest was steady and peaceful, completely unaware of the war raging inside his father. James reached out, running a hand gently over the baby's head. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, James felt tears slip down his face. He had always believed he could fix things, that every problem had a solution, that every battle could be won. But now, he wasn't sure if he could win this one. Not this time. A choice that changes everything. The next morning, James packed a bag. Lily was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the baby monitor. When she saw him standing there, duffel bag in hand, her lips parted in surprise. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice small. James inhaled deeply. "Not forever. But I think I need to go for a while." Lily looked down, nodding slowly. "Where?" she whispered. James swallowed hard. "I don't know. But I need to figure myself out. I need to fix what's broken in me before I can fix anything else." Lily didn't argue. She didn't tell him to stay. She just nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. James stepped forward hesitantly. "Lily, I love you. I love him. And I swear I'll come back." She exhaled shakily. "You better." James reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I will." And with that, he turned and walked out the door. For the first time since coming home, James didn't know if he would ever truly find his way back. Lost in the aftermath. Walking away doesn't mean leaving. The house behind him felt heavy. James could still hear the creak of the door as it swung shut, a final punctuation mark on the conversation that had just torn him apart. His boots crunched against the gravel driveway as he walked toward his truck, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The sun was barely rising, casting a dull orange glow across the sky. It was quiet, too quiet. He hesitated before opening the driver's side door, his fingers gripping the handle. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn back, to throw himself at Lily's feet and beg her to let him stay. But staying wouldn't fix this. He had spent his entire adult life fixing things, problems, battle plans, conflicts. But this wasn't a battlefield. He couldn't strategize his way back into his wife's heart. Not yet. James exhaled sharply and climbed into the truck, starting the engine. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to go. A man on the road, a family in pieces. The drive stretched into hours. He didn't turn on the radio. The hum of the engine was enough to keep him company. Every now and then, his mind wandered back to Lily, to the pain in her eyes when she realized what he had done. "You didn't just make a mistake. You doubted me, our marriage, our son." Her voice echoed in his head like a bullet ricocheting inside his skull. James gripped the wheel tighter. He had done the unthinkable. He had questioned the one person who had never given up on him, never stopped believing in him, even when war had turned him into someone neither of them recognized. The truck veered off the main highway onto an old back road leading to a familiar place, his uncle's cabin, tucked away in the woods. A part of him felt ashamed for running here, but where else could he go? The cabin was small, worn from time, but it had been his childhood refuge after his parents died. His uncle, Robert Carter, was the only family he had left. James pulled up beside the porch, killing the engine. The door creaked open before he even knocked. Robert stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He was older now, his face lined with age and experience, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Took you long enough," Robert grunted, stepping aside. James hesitated before stepping inside. The cabin smelled of old books, wood smoke, and coffee, just like it always had. Robert didn't ask any questions. He simply poured James a cup of black coffee and slid it across the table. James stared at it, then let out a heavy sigh. "I screwed up, Uncle Rob." Robert nodded slowly. "I figured." James clenched his jaw. I took a paternity test." The silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fireplace. Finally, Robert let out a slow breath. "And?" James ran a hand over his face. "He's mine." His uncle didn't look surprised. And your wife. James let out a bitter laugh. She's not sure if she can forgive me. Robert leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. Well, son, you brought that on yourself. James flinched. You spent years learning how to survive war, Robert continued. But no one ever taught you how to survive peace. And that's the problem, isn't it? James swallowed hard. His uncle's words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Robert took a sip of his coffee before setting the mug down. You've been trained to see threats where there are none, to expect betrayal before it happens. Hell, James, I get it. I fought my own battles after I came home. But you know what war never teaches men like us. James shook his head. How to trust, Robert said. How to let go. James clenched his fists. I didn't mean to doubt her. But you did, Robert said simply. Because you're scared. Because part of you doesn't believe you deserve a family, a home, love. And you know what, kid? If you keep thinking like that, you'll make sure you don't have any of it left. James sucked in a sharp breath. You have a choice, Robert continued. You can sit here, drink coffee, and wallow in your own guilt. Or you can fight like hell to make things right. James sat in silence, his mind racing. Meanwhile, back home, Lily stood at the window, watching the empty driveway. She had thought she would feel relief when James left, but all she felt was a gaping, hollow ache in her chest. She had spent years being strong for him, standing by him, waiting through deployments, through sleepless nights, through the ghosts that followed him home. And now, when he had the chance to fight for her, for their son, he had walked away. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She turned, glancing at the baby monitor. Their son was sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the storm between his parents. Lily sat down on the couch, hugging her knees to her chest. Did I do the right thing? A part of her wanted to chase after him, to tell him to come home, to fix things now. But another part of her knew that James couldn't fix this. Not yet. He needed to understand the damage he had done, and she needed to decide if she could ever trust him again. The thought made her stomach twist. For the first time since James had left, Lily wasn't sure if he would ever come back. And even if he did, she wasn't sure if she would be waiting. The road to redemption. The weight of guilt. The cabin was dark, save for the soft glow of a single lamp on the wooden table. James sat in silence, his fingers pressed against his temples, his breath slow and heavy. The past few days had felt like a fever dream. Except there was no waking up from this. He had broken something between him and Lily. And now, sitting here in his uncle's cabin, away from the home he had dreamed of for years, he felt like a man without a compass. Robert sat across from him, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching him carefully. You got a plan? The older man asked. James exhaled. I don't know where to start. Robert shook his head. That's your problem, kid. You're looking at this like it's a mission. Like if you execute the right steps, you'll win. But this isn't a war zone. You can't tactically fix a broken heart. James clenched his jaw. Then what do I do? Robert leaned forward, his eyes sharp. You decide if you're willing to fight for her the right way. No tactics. No strategy. Just honesty and time. James swallowed hard. He had fought insurgents, survived explosions, and carried dying men in his arms. But nothing felt as terrifying as the idea of standing in front of Lily, fully exposed, and asking her to believe in him again. Could she? Would she? James gritted his teeth. I won't give up. Lily's struggle. Back home, Lily sat in the nursery, gently rocking their son in her arms. Her chest ached with exhaustion. She wasn't just tired from caring for a newborn. She was tired of fighting for a man who wouldn't even trust her. James had left. She knew he thought he was doing it to protect them, to clear his head. But all it had done was cement the truth she had been trying to ignore. James wasn't ready to be the man she needed. Lily ran her fingers through the baby's soft curls. "What do we do, sweetheart?" she whispered. He cooed softly, completely unaware of the storm raging inside his mother. A part of her missed James desperately. She missed his voice in the morning, the way he would brush a strand of hair behind her ear when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She missed the way he had once looked at her, with absolute certainty. But that certainty had shattered, and she didn't know if they could ever put the pieces back together. Facing the truth. It took 2 weeks before James finally made a decision. He had spent days drowning in guilt, wrestling with his demons, listening to Robert's blunt but necessary wisdom. And now he was standing outside his house again, duffel bag in hand, heart pounding. The lights were on inside. He could see Lily moving through the kitchen, her shoulders tense, her hair tied back in a loose bun. James inhaled deeply before knocking. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. Lily stood in front of him, barefoot, wearing one of his old sweatshirts, her arms crossed. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. James swallowed hard. "Can I come in?" She didn't answer right away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she stepped aside. James entered cautiously, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him. The house looked the same, but it felt different, like he was stepping into someone else's life. Lily leaned against the counter, studying him. "Why are you here, James?" James exhaled slowly. "Because I made the worst mistake of my life, and I need to make it right." Lily's jaw tightened. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" James hesitated. "I don't have a perfect answer, Lily, but I know I can't fix this overnight. I know I have to earn back your trust." She let out a bitter laugh. "Trust?" Her eyes glistened. "James, you looked at me, the woman who carried your child, who stayed up at night praying you'd come home alive. And you thought I cheated on you." James flinched. "I was wrong." Her voice broke. "You didn't just doubt me. You doubted us." Silence. James clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I let my fear control me. I let war get in my head, and I let it hurt you." Lily shook her head, blinking away tears. "What do you want from me, James?" He stepped closer, voice shaking. "I want another chance. I want to fight for us, Lily, not the way I fought in war. The way a husband should fight for his wife." Lily's breath hitched. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. But the scars he had left ran deep. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. James' heart clenched. "Tell me what you need." Lily's lips trembled. "Time." James exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then I'll wait." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And if I can't ever trust you again?" James stepped forward, gently brushing a tear from her face. "Then I'll spend my life proving to you that I deserve it." Lily closed her eyes, her body shaking from the weight of her emotions. For the first time since the paternity test, she let him touch her. James didn't push further. He didn't beg. He just stood there, holding the woman he had hurt, knowing that this was the first step in a battle he could not afford to lose. A long road ahead. That night, James slept on the couch. It wasn't comfortable, but it was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't expecting things to be normal overnight. He wasn't expecting Lily to suddenly forgive him. But he was back. And this time, he wasn't running. Fighting for redemption. A house divided. James awoke to the scent of coffee brewing and the faint sounds of Lily moving through the kitchen. His body ached from sleeping on the couch, but he didn't care. He was home. The real battle, however, was just beginning. Lily wasn't avoiding him anymore, but that didn't mean things were back to normal. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable, easy quiet they had once shared. It was tense, fragile. James sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. The baby monitor on the coffee table blinked softly, playing the gentle sounds of their son stirring upstairs. This was his family, and he had almost lost it. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He stood, stretching his sore muscles before heading to the kitchen. Lily was standing at the counter, her back to him, pouring coffee into a mug. She had always been a morning person, but today her posture was stiff, her movements careful. James cleared his throat softly. She didn't turn around. Instead, she set a second mug beside her own and slid it toward him without a word. James swallowed hard. It was a small gesture, but it was something. "Thanks," he said quietly, picking up the cup. Lily finally turned to face him, her tired eyes meeting his. "I didn't do it for you." James nodded, accepting that. "I know." She exhaled, looking down at her coffee. "Are you planning on staying on the couch forever?" The question caught him off guard. "I'll sleep wherever you want me to," he said carefully. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "That's not what I meant." James frowned. "Then what did you mean?" Lily hesitated, fingers tightening around her mug. "I don't know what this is anymore, James. I don't know if we're still us." The words were a knife to the chest. James forced himself to stay steady. "Lily, I know I messed up. I know I broke something between us. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." Lily let out a bitter laugh. "You already did." James flinched, but before he could respond, their son's cries echoed from upstairs. Lily turned immediately, placing her coffee down and heading toward the stairs. James stood there, gripping his mug tightly, feeling more lost than ever. The weight of every choice. James spent the next few days showing Lily, not just telling her, that he was willing to change. He took over night feedings, letting her get much-needed rest. He made sure the house was clean, ran errands, and did everything he could to be present. But it wasn't just about chores. It was about proving to her that he was here, fully, completely. Lily didn't say much, but James noticed small things. She wasn't flinching away from him anymore. She let him hold their son longer, trusting him with the baby more. And sometimes, just sometimes, he caught her looking at him when she thought he wasn't watching. The first time it happened, he almost stopped breathing. But he didn't push. He was learning to take things one step at a time. A breaking point. It was late at night when things finally came to a head. James was sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album he had found tucked away in their bookshelf. Pictures of their wedding, their first apartment, the first ultrasound of their son. Each image was a reminder of the life they had built together. Lily appeared in the doorway, watching him silently. He didn't notice her at first, too lost in memories. But when he finally looked up, she was staring at him like she was seeing a ghost. "Lily?" His voice was gentle. She walked toward him slowly, wrapping her arms around herself. "Do you ever wish you hadn't come home?" James' heart nearly stopped. "What?" She let out a shuddering breath. "I mean, you were a soldier for so long. Maybe part of you still wants to be out there instead of here." James set the photo album down and stood up, closing the distance between them. He looked into her eyes, the woman who had waited for him, believed in him, loved him even after everything. "I wanted to come home to you, Lily," he said firmly. "You and our son. That's all I've ever wanted." Lily's lips trembled. "Then why did you doubt me?" James inhaled sharply. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of you, of myself, of not being enough, of not knowing how to be a father, of failing you." Lily clenched her fists. "You didn't fail me, James. You betrayed me." James closed his eyes for a second, nodding. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Silence. Then Lily whispered, "So do I." The pain in her voice wrecked him. "I don't know how to forgive you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can." James reached out slowly, cautiously. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. "Then I'll wait," he said, voice rough. "As long as it takes." Lily closed her eyes, tears slipping down her face. And then, for the first time in weeks, she stepped forward and leaned against his chest. James held her gently, afraid to move too fast, afraid to break the moment. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, breathing her in. She was still here. She was still his. And maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. The final battle. Fragile steps toward healing. The morning after Lily allowed herself to lean into James' embrace, the air in the house felt different. The silence, once cold and full of tension, had softened into something fragile. Not quite trust, not quite forgiveness, but something. James didn't push. He woke early, making breakfast while Lily stayed upstairs with the baby. He brewed her coffee the way she liked it. 2 sugars, just a splash of milk. He didn't expect her to take it, but he left it on the kitchen counter anyway. Lily walked in a few minutes later, her hair still messy from sleep. She hesitated when she saw the cup. Then, without a word, she picked it up and took a sip. James exhaled slowly. It was a small victory. They sat at the kitchen table together, the baby gurgling in his high chair between them. Neither of them spoke much, but for the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't painful. It was rebuilding, brick by fragile brick. The ghosts between them. That night, James woke up sweating. The dream had been vivid, too vivid. Gunfire. The deafening roar of explosions. The feeling of sand in his mouth. The scent of burning flesh in the air. He was back in the desert. He was losing men again. And this time, he wasn't waking up. James gasped awake, his chest heaving. The room was dark. The weight of the past clung to him, making it hard to breathe. Then, a soft voice. James? He turned sharply, his heart still racing. Lily stood in the doorway, watching him with concern. You were having a nightmare, she said softly. James pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Yeah. Lily hesitated. You never talk about them. James let out a slow breath. Because they never stop. She stepped inside the room. What was it about? James hesitated. How could he explain that the battlefield never left him? That no matter how far away he was from war, it still lived in his head. Finally, he whispered, the last mission. Lily sat down beside him on the edge of the bed, watching him closely. James took a shaky breath. We were ambushed. We lost 2 men before we even knew what was happening. I had to hold one of them as he died. Lily's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. James ran a hand through his hair. I keep seeing his face, every night. His voice broke slightly. I should have saved him. Lily reached out hesitantly, her fingers barely brushing against his. James. His throat tightened, and then I came home, and I doubted the one thing that was supposed to be good in my life. I questioned my wife. I questioned my son. And I can't take that back. Lily's fingers curled around his hand. She didn't say anything at first, but she didn't pull away. Finally, she whispered, You can't undo what's done, but you can decide how to move forward. James exhaled slowly. He had spent so long looking backward, at war, at loss, at the damage he had caused, that he had forgotten how to move forward. And maybe, just maybe, Lily was still willing to walk beside him. A test of trust. A week passed. Then 2. James kept showing up. He wasn't just waiting for Lily to forgive him. He was proving that he deserved a second chance. Then, one night, Lily surprised him. I need you to come with me, she said suddenly, standing by the front door. James frowned. Where? Just trust me. James hesitated only a moment before grabbing his jacket and following her outside. They drove in silence. Finally, Lily pulled up in front of a small therapy center. James stared at the building, his hands tightening on his lap. Lily took a breath. James, I need to know that you're willing to fight for us. But I also need to know that you're willing to fight for yourself. James swallowed hard. Lily, "You carry too much alone," she interrupted gently. "I don't want you to go through this alone anymore." James clenched his jaw. For years, he had survived by burying his pain, by ignoring it, by pretending that if he just kept moving forward, it would eventually disappear. But it hadn't. And it never would, unless he faced it. Lily watched him carefully. "I'm not asking for miracles. I'm just asking you to try." James looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself hope. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll try." Rebuilding a family. The first therapy session was harder than any battlefield James had ever faced. He talked about the war, about the men he lost, about the fear that had followed him home. But most of all, he talked about Lily, about the guilt, about the way he had almost destroyed their marriage, about how desperately he wanted to fix it. The therapist listened carefully, nodding. At the end of the session, James exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When he walked outside, Lily was waiting for him in the parking lot. She didn't say anything. She just took his hand. And for the first time in months, James felt like he belonged. The road ahead. Lily didn't forgive him overnight, but she allowed him back into her heart, piece by piece. James spent weeks proving himself, not with words, but with actions. He held their son every night. He kissed Lily on the forehead before bed. He told her about his nightmares instead of keeping them inside. And slowly, the walls between them began to crack. One evening, James was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, when Lily walked outside and sat beside him. She didn't say anything at first. Then, softly, she whispered, "I want to try again." James turned to her, his heart pounding. "You do?" She nodded. "But James, if you ever doubt me like that again, if you ever make me feel like I'm not enough, I won't stay." James reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "You are enough," he whispered. "You always have been." Lily exhaled shakily. Then, for the first time in months, she kissed him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. And for James, that was enough. For now. Epilogue. The future they chose. Months passed, then a year. James continued therapy. He continued proving to Lily that he would never make the same mistake again. And one evening, as they sat in the backyard watching their son play, Lily reached for his hand and whispered, "I love you." James closed his eyes. She had said it before, but this time, he knew she meant it. This time, it wasn't just history or habit. It was a choice, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure it was the best choice she had ever made, because Lily had saved him. And this time, James was finally ready to save himself.